Jennifer Lawless here from American University. We were just discussing where things are going to stand in the federal government's response to what's happening with Texas. I mean, as you said, it's still in the middle of obviously what's taking place down there. How soon will they actually take anything up in terms of, putting a spending measure associated with this?
I think it's going to be a while because we really have no idea. There are going to be short-term costs associated with moving people and providing temporary housing. There are going to be longer-term costs in terms of relocating people semi-permanently. And then beyond that, there are going to be major infrastructure expenses, and it's way too early to even know what the condition of the roads will look like when the water subsides.
Well, obviously, folks are keeping all eyes on Texas. We usually talk about what's happening inside the Beltway, but natural disaster of huge proportions, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the folks there in Texas. But let's talk a little bit about something that occurred, maybe some news items since then, and let's go to the pardon of Arpaio. What's the sense of that? Trump thought maybe he'd get a boost from the base, but we've seen a lot of pushback.
There's been a ton of pushback in two different ways. The first is the Democrats, as expected, and a lot of the establishment Republicans have been taken aback by the pardon because this is not just a political pardon of somebody who might have been treated unfairly, somebody who actually violated a federal court order and did so because he was racially profiling, and we're 2 weeks out from Charlottesville, where race has been right on the agenda. So it just demonstrated sort of an unwillingness to come to terms with the events of the recent weeks. The second thing about the pardon is actually linked to Texas, which is when he released the information and said that he was going to do it. He didn't do it at the rally in Phoenix on Tuesday. Instead, he waited until the end of the news cycle on Friday, when all eyes were on Texas, to make this announcement. And then, sort of unbelievably, yesterday he said that it was because he knew a lot of people were going to be paying attention. So, I think it's a way to rile and rally the base, but the base is only about 35% of the population, right? And he's now given yet, another piece of ammunition to the 2/3 of the people that are becoming increasingly dissatisfied.
And also reports this week of folks tied to the Trump camp having discussions with Moscow about a Trump Tower during the campaign. How big is this, Jennifer?
So this is big. I'm constantly watching cable news. I'm constantly reading the paper. I'm constantly talking to other pundits. This seemed like a turning point to me when this information came out, because it's the first clear piece of evidence we have where Donald Trump himself has explicitly lied about involvement with Russia. We know that these negotiations took place during the campaign. There are multiple people involved with the campaign that have said this. And so juxtaposing that information to Trump's multiple statements about how he's had no deals in Russia, he has no connections with Russia, he's had no conversations with Russia, is the first time that we actually see the president himself lying about dealings with Russia during the campaign. And so it also highlights, I think, how effective Bob Mueller has been in trying to pull together all of the pieces of information he'll need to ultimately make a recommendation.
So right now, as you mentioned, it's information that's at odds of what we had heard from the president previously. But as he has not been subpoenaed himself, and as Mueller's sort of going through the legal channels on his side, is right now this an optics issue before it formally becomes a legal issue? And even from a legal standpoint, Jennifer, is it more of the fact that it's not necessarily the crime, but the cover-up per se? I mean, could a campaign have discussions with a national government pertaining to business deals? So, when the rubber meets the road here, kind of what's the sticking point?
We've heard time and time again that it's the cover-up that always is the most problematic. And at this point, there are no perjury charges can be levied because he hasn't lied under oath about anything. But I think what this means is that should Trump himself be subpoenaed, or should some of his associates be called before the grand jury, they now are well aware of the fact that it's public knowledge, and Mueller has the information to suggest that these conversations did take place and a deal was trying to be brokered. And that's going to affect the way that they speak about connections with Russia. So, I don't think legally this changes anything. I do think that it suggests to people that the investigation is moving ahead, and the federal grand jury is going to have access to information that probably the Trump administration and a lot of the campaign surrogates had assumed would not be available.
So we'll see what happens with that pertaining to the constant question of Russia. Obviously, all eyes on Texas. But finally, before we let you go, what of North Korea in the last couple of days?
I mean, it's kind of, I was watching the news last night and I felt bad that we were sort of veering away from Texas, but there are many other news stories that are actually very important right now, and North Korea is one of them. Kim Jong-un launched a missile over Japan, and Japan called it a very serious attack. And a very serious incident, and it also demonstrates that he could do the same thing and reach Guam. And you know, Donald Trump said this morning that all options are on the table, and this suggests that, you know, where we thought we were last week, where we could reach sort of a cooling point, is no longer the case. And from what I've heard, it's in large part because of Trump's speech, where he made it clear, where he alleged that Kim Jong-un and North Korea respected the United States and were going to sort of do what they were told, when there was no evidence that actually happened, and the North Korean government decided, we'll show them. So this is not a game of chicken I would ever want to play.
Do we get a sense, I mean, from what we've seen so far during his presidency, it does appear that the president operates sort of under his own volition a lot of the time. Do we get a sense that he is listening to the advice of, he's got a lot of military on, obviously, on his staff? You know, will he defer to them, do you think, if things get really heated up with North Korea?
Well, I think in terms of specific policies, yes. And we saw that when he made the Afghanistan speech, right? Everything that he said in that speech was, you know, conducive to what the generals had suggested. And I think most of what he said about North Korea is also somewhat consistent. It's his tone and it's the off-the-cuff remarks that are ultimately going to lead us down a path toward nuclear war. Right? It's not when he actually stops and thinks about what policies we should have in place and what his generals are advocating for. So when he's reading off a teleprompter, when he's, you know, at a meeting and Rex Tillerson is there, Jim Mattis is there, and everybody can discuss these things peacefully and calmly, I think it's fine. It's when he goes off script, and there are too many off script moments. And that's what we saw, I think, in terms of what Kim Jong-un was responding to the other day.
Before I let you go, obviously, with what's going on in Texas, do you think that this dominates the news cycle, especially as it pertains to what we'll be watching on the Sunday shows this week? Is just, again, how this ends up being and how folks recover there and how much money goes there really one of the, again, is it just going to take up most of the oxygen in the foreseeable future?
I think it is, but this is now probably the 8th consecutive week where I've said something like that and then something else happens. You know, so I do think that this is going to be something that garners a lot of attention, but North Korea for the next 2 or 3 days, I think, is something to watch. The other thing I would note is that the hurricane in Texas also derails tax reform and infrastructure quite a bit, not only because people's attention is turned elsewhere, but also because this is going to be a huge federal outlay. And yes, the manner in which we then start talking about balancing budgets and reaching debt ceilings and apparently shutting down the government if we don't build a wall are now sort of all off the table, at least for a little while.
Well, the best laid plans, obviously Mother Nature has other ones as well. So again, we wish the folks in Texas well. We wish you well in DC, as you said, hot and humid there inside the Beltway. Wish you a great Labor Day weekend. We'll see you when we get back on next Tuesday.
You too.
Okay, bye. Thanks, Jennifer.